So, Chana, let's dive straight into it. You are a member of the Frog Lake Nation, and at the
Mhm.
same time, you have a very successful career in finance
Yes,
with 2 degrees in banking. And you have a job today where you're the CEO of the Alberta Indigenous Opportunities Corporation, which seems to be cut out for you, right?
yes.
So, can you give us a brief introduction to the AIOC, its history, what it does, and what it means to you to be the
Yeah.
CEO of this institution?
So the Alberta Indigenous Opportunities Corporation was started in 2019. And, not unique to Canada, Indigenous communities, as a result of legacy colonialism, have suffered economically in our country. And that has been from systemic barriers due to the Indian Act that was put in to manage Indigenous peoples under the British colonial rule. And that act is still in place today. And one of the restrictions in that act is that Indigenous people cannot borrow, they cannot hold collateral for property on reserve because it's Crown land. You cannot hold collateral, you cannot seize collateral. And so through the generations, that has created this barrier in access to capital. And when you think about how anyone accumulates wealth, how businesses grow, you need to be able to borrow and access money. And so, what this program was designed was to, rather than reconstitute the act, was designed to create a bridge to that access to capital in a new way. And so, we used the strength of the Alberta balance sheet in a guarantee format. So, like a co-signature on a mortgage, if you have those kinds of things in your countries, like a co-signer on a mortgage to backstop the capital access and also to get a preferred lending rate. So at a very close to a government rate. And so the reconciliation part is that there's more net income flowing to the communities and they have this access to capital. So both of those elements. Our organization was designed to facilitate those transactions and support those transactions through capacity grant funding, through loan guarantees against it's a sub-sovereign jurisdiction in Canada, the province of Alberta.
Aside from loan guarantees, you provide capacity building as well for the
Yes,
communities that come to you. Why do you do
yes,
that?
yes. Okay. These deals are very large, very complex. So you're working with and partnering with multinational corporations. And so there's a level of expertise and complexity that is required to assess, navigate, negotiate, and close those transactions. So we provide capacity in actually two ways. One, we provide funding for the First Nations or the Métis groups to hire advisors, so they can hire lawyers, they can hire financial advisors, they can hire bankers to help them source the debt, to negotiate a great rate and appropriate deal terms. The other is that we support from an intellectual capacity standpoint. So we go on the journey with them and provide our opinion in addition to the advisors. We help the negotiations, we help the translation, because the way that the First Nations do business and the way that the corporations do business, they're not always compatible.
So, in your experience, what have been sort of the financial aspects that make these deals work, and what's a red flag for you?
Mm, okay. Well, we like to have long-term contracts to the extent that we can. And so we've lengthened amortizations for assets that have long life assets. If you have a pipeline, it's easily a 50-year asset. So it's not hard to do a 25, 30-year loan against that, right? Um, the complexity for us is often the Indigenous communities are a consortium. So then the corporate partner looks and says, well, I have to deal with 7 partners instead of one. I want to deal with one person, make it easy for you. So you'll see, and we have this slide a little bit later, I think, and we can share it with your group. But we have a document that describes how you can go about these transactions and how you can narrow it down to a handful of representatives negotiating on behalf of the whole. So, but it really talks about, we worked in systems where a group of nations will elect or appoint a representative to negotiate on behalf of the whole, or two or three people or five people to negotiate on behalf of the whole. And then typically we help to equip those people with the knowledge that they need or with advisors to support. So all of that reduces the complexity and brings it more on par to commercial terms. It's never going to be exactly that way, but it's also a learning journey for the corporate partners. They need to understand the perspective of the Indigenous communities. And I do really firmly believe that the corporate leaders are better executives and better people leaders as a result of their learnings and knowledge of Indigenous people.
Despite, all the financial expertise, that's the easy part. And that the more difficult part and the most important bit is the relationship. Why is
Yes.
that?
Well, Indigenous people are long-term investors. We're not, they're not here to buy and sell assets. They're not a private equity fund that are looking for a short-term return. They want to be your long-term partner. So, many investors just want to make their return and be out in 5 to 10 years. And that is not the case. Indigenous people want to be your partners typically for a lifetime or longer.
Right. Yeah, makes a lot of sense. So here in this part of the world, when we share the story of Canada and the
Yeah.
experience of Canada, some of the reaction we get is, oh, you're bringing us an example from a developed country. The indigenous
Mhm.
people there are, they work together very easily. They agree on things all the time, and it's easy for them to do these kinds of deals. But you've told some stories that
Yeah.
show that it's not that easy. And then could you
Oh,
give us some
no.
examples?
Yes, I can. So Canada is a developed country, yes. But if you have any knowledge of our First Nations reserves, of our Inuit people, um, our outcomes are far from a developed country, very far. Our levels of education, every social metric you want to have, we are very far, far from a developed country. And I think of it this way: when you're when you have so few economic opportunities, you're fighting over economic morsels, tiny crumbs at the table, just tiny pieces. And so when you're fighting, um, like dogs for over just a morsel of food, of course you don't get along. And the same is true, honestly, in Canada. Our Indigenous people have been so held back from opportunity that we were fighting over economic morsels. And so what I have seen in more than one transaction is, um, neighboring groups that didn't get along because they were fighting for the limited economic opportunities that they had. And among other things, politics always gets in the way. Number one rule of any economic development for me is to keep the politicians and the economics separate, focus on the economics and the opportunity, and let the politicians manage the politics. So there's all of those components. But I shared with you one of the earlier deals that we did in the region that I'm from, in that Cold Lake region, and um, my dad said to me, Chana, I never thought I would see the day that the Cree, the Dene, and the Métis were doing a transaction together. And yet here we are all celebrating.
So, you just mentioned how important it is to separate business from politics. That was going to be
Mhm.
my next question.
Yes.
Uh, can you give us a little bit more detail why that is so important?
Politicians have to answer to the people, and everyone is their stakeholder. Everyone has a vote and can influence whether a politician is successful or not. In in business and in economic development, I think we have to be relentlessly committed to quality opportunities. And so, what that means to me is that there's lots of great ideas out there, but that doesn't mean that they're a great economic or a viable economic opportunity. And so, we need to be very relentlessly focused on the very best opportunities and making sure that the Indigenous people advance. But the politicians need to be able to support a broad range. And so our interests are not exactly aligned. So you have the politicians who need to appeal to as broad a swath as possible. And then you have the economic focus, which is very narrow. And so the agreement that I've said to our politicians is we have two different constituents groups. So we will assess and say no. We will find the good opportunities, and you all know how many opportunities you have to look at to find a good one. They don't grow plentifully, and so you must be relentlessly focused on the best ones and not lose money for the nation or the Indigenous peoples. And then the politicians can, there's many other programs from my perspective that can support grassroots economic development, that have a higher risk tolerance, that are trying to spur innovation. Those aren't what our program is designed to do. And so we need to stick to what we are doing. And also, politicians are not deeply connected or understanding to some of the risks that are involved to manipulating deal terms. If you get suboptimal terms, I'm a big believer that the capital markets are efficient and that you will get to the best outcome by letting them work the best, which is why we have the slide about not interrupting the cycle of capital. I think that's really, really important.
And my final question is, I think you are very good at reading a room,
Okay.
and
Thank you.
and so when a group comes to your door and you
Mm-hmm.
have the corporate partner and the community partner, and you're looking at them for the first time, what gives you a hint that this is going to work well? And on the contrary, what makes you think that this is going to be longer than expected?
Okay, well, I would say I'm an optimist, Juan. So I think anything can be done where there is will. If the two parties want to find a path through, if they are genuinely at the table to find a path through, they will find it, and we will help them find it. But you have to be committed, and you have to be open-minded, and sometimes you need to really remember what brought you to the table in the first place.
Hmm.
Always anchor yourself in why you're there. And then I think you can move mountains. I really do.